Grace was appointed the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Curator of Northwest Art in January of 2017. She is also currently an adjunct assistant professor of art in the School of Art and Design at Portland State University. Prior to joining the museum, her most recent curatorial projects have included the landmark show at the Center for Contemporary Art, Santa Fe, which looked at ecological perspectives by artists located in the Western United States, and an exhibition titled Yesterday's Future at the Orange County Greater Park Gallery, which examined the city of Irvine's idealized master plan of a university and a city encapsulated by architect William Pereira's design of UCI campus, University of California, Irvine's campus. During her tenure at the Laguna Art Museum, projects included a site-specific commission, An Elongated Now, by Lita Albuquerque for the museum's second Art and Nature Festival. Grace has curated Best Kept Secret, UCI, and the Development of Contemporary Art in Southern California, 1964 to 1971, in conjunction with the Getty's Pacific Standard Time Initiative, and produced the accompanying award-winning catalog. And this project in particular really distinguished Grace from the many candidates who applied for this position. Her ability to look at the region and celebrate it not only for what it is for that place, but also on a national and international discourse. Beginning in summer of 2012, she created a serial contemporary art program, Expose, focusing on solo exhibitions of emerging and mid-career artists. Grace received a dual BA degree in art history and art practice from the University of California, Berkeley, and received her MA degree in curatorial practice from the College of Arts in San Francisco. So it's a great pleasure to have Grace here with you this evening, but also a part of our museum. So Grace, thank you for joining me, and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're going to start out right away with a bang, because I always like to ask the curators, how did they come to curation? And it's always fun to have a nice anecdotal story, and this is a fantastic story, and I'm going to let Grace explain what this is you're looking at. So Grace, let's begin.
Basically, my slides will be all downhill from here. So what you see on the left is my mom. She is the person on the right, and she was in a music group called Jumble Sisters in Korea, South Korea. And it was one of the early Korean pop moments. So you could say she was in one of the OG K-pop movements. And they traveled a lot around Asia, Southeast Asia. And then on the right is a super band where my dad was a drummer, and he was in a band called the Black Stones, and they were really influenced by the Rolling Stones, and they shared the same management. So the management wanted to bring the supergroup to tour the US, so they merged, wanted 4 gals and 4 guys to come together. And this was their promotional, one of their promotional photo shoots before they came to the States in 1974. So they came on an entertainment visa, and several decided to stay. My parents, that's where my parents first met. And yeah, and that's how I came to be. But yeah, I talk about how I kind of rebelled because they were so ultra cool. I rebelled by going the opposite way. So I was painfully shy. I don't think my parents really even heard me sing. I was really intimidated by the fact that they were both such entertainers. My dad was very charismatic. He could really kind of hold a room just with his personality, and I admired that and was so intimidated by it, and I was terribly shy, so I went the opposite way.
So curators as rebels, and that's what we all are, rebelling against something, and we immerse ourselves in academia. So sure, great, I love this. So fast forward, this is a fascinating images, several images, and this is really related to Grace's graduate work and her graduate degree, looking at this very important Korean artist. Explain more about what we're looking at, Grace, here, and what inspired you to explore her life, and what were you looking at?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very artistic household. My parents were very encouraging in a lot of ways, but we didn't go to museums at all. And I was growing up in Santa Clara, California, and I remember there was a Namjoon Park exhibition at the San Jose Museum, and dragging my dad to chaperone me to go see the exhibition, and to know that there were Korean American artists was really exciting. So when I was at UC Berkeley, I had come across Teresa's Hak Kyung-cha's work as an intern at the museum, and had learned that Larry Rinder, who was the curator there from a while back, had done his master's thesis on Teresa's work, and because of the work that he did, the family donated the entire body of work to the Berkeley Art Museum. And I thought that was such a powerful thing, that someone's own curiosity and helping to unravel the mystery of this artist's work could bring such a generous gesture. And so with Teresa's work, for my master's thesis, I was really looking at this film. It's called White Dust from Mongolia, and it was an unfinished body of work. She passed away quite tragically in 1982, and so this work that she was working on had completely just stopped. And what there was her notes, a couple films, not nearly close to editing phase, and then what does it mean to have this in her body of work? What does it mean to consider an unfinished work? So those were some of the things I was grappling with in my thesis.
Yeah, and I think what comes out, and if you've seen the program, Grace has done a really wonderful job of incorporating multiple mediums in the program now. So you'll see not only objects, but film, and I think it certainly is reflective, and it starts with this research that you did early on, because as I understand Teresa's work, it is multidisciplinary, exploratory film, art, music, theater as well.
It is, yeah. The work that really got to me and got me deep into Teresa's work was a book called Dictée, and it had a lot of layers to it. It had her own heritage, stories about her mother and her grandmother, the stories around Joan of Arc, Catholicism, upbringing, colonialism, her language, her use of language through French, English, Korean, all of these layers. And the book itself had a very filmic quality that I really enjoyed. And Dictée is interesting because I think it's really, it's much more studied in the literary field, but for me I saw it more as a filmic medium.
And then the program you started at the Laguna Art Museum, and you and I have talked about this, how you looked at other models and created a unique opportunity for Laguna, which was inspired by other things. Talk a little bit about this program, but also some of your influences.
Yeah, so Berkeley Art Museum's Matrix program I really loved. Heidi Zuckerman-Jacobson was the curator at the time, and I remember being an intern and completely intimidated by her, but always like peeking in her office.
She's now the director of the Aspen Art Museum. Has
Yes.
really pushed that museum forward.
Yes, yeah, it's true. And also Apex. Apex was a model that I really came upon and loved that existed. And these kind of opportunities for a close look in a small way was something that I really appreciated. So at Laguna Art Museum is a pretty small museum, and a regional museum devoted to the art of California. And there's this basement space that's the previous curators, no one really liked. It was dingy. There's heavy columns, this concrete tile, which had names of some of the early founders, but otherwise completely unattractive, this kind of imposing ceiling. And for me, I thought, this is great for showing film and contemporary work. So I proposed this program for that space, and it worked out quite well. So my first artist was Peter Bo Ratman, who actually showed recently here through the Northwest Film Center. And again, I kicked it off with a film piece, just as I did with Apex and Sam Hamilton. And I didn't do it with short films either. These were both 60-minute films, so it is quite a demand on the viewer. But I loved that idea of asking people to really slow down and take a look and really consider the work that the artist is doing. So psychohydrography on the left is where Peter would take thousands of photos from the Sierras down to the Los Angeles aqueducts out to the ocean, so capturing our water source. And then he would sew all the photographs together so they would have this kind of filmic quality to it. And then the same thing with tectonics, where he would go back and forth between the US and Mexico border from California to Texas, and capture the fluidity or the lack of fluidity between the borders.
So this, Grace's tenure was really important for me at Laguna because the director there called me up, or actually I saw him, a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Warner, and he said, there is a woman in your community who is one of the best curators we ever had. She had to move there, and you need to hire her. And I never forgot that. And even though we did a national search, Grace was always at the forefront of my mind, given that strong recommendation from Malcolm. And I think it has to do with the great work you've done there.
Thank you.
So, yeah. And here's another artist. And again, I think this artist, Beatrice DaCosta's work, is shaping some of your vision here and how you're thinking about our program. And talk about this piece in particular.
Sure. So Beatrice DaCosta was an art professor at UC Irvine, and she was an artist who had kind of international recognition but was not showing locally. And I had followed her work for several years and had come across this body of work. And when we were in conversation, she was telling me that she was going through cancer treatment herself, and that's where this body of work stemmed from. So it also ties into the question of the thesis and what does it mean to show in unfinished work. And Beatrice passed away 2 months before the show opened. So I worked very closely with her partner, who's also an artist, Beatrice's studio assistant, and then talking closely with the museum staff. And it was always, would she agree? Would she like this? And that was the frame of my thinking for this whole process. And because some of the work was unfinished, there was some sparseness to the installation, and Malcolm actually at that time suggested to add a more participatory element. And our education curator prompted some questions about if anyone has experience with cancer in their lives. And so it was a set of Post-it notes that just exploded by the end of the exhibition, and it was so beautiful to see.
And this was, again, the project that I mentioned that Grace took or oversaw as part of the Getty Initiative, Pacific Standard Time, which is such an important initiative for the California region, where all the museums come together and present exhibitions about place. And this was your show, and it was really beautifully done. And some of the artists we're going to know, I want to have Grace talk a little bit about this. The publication was fantastic. But yeah, explain a little bit about this show and your approach.
Yeah, so you know, Tony DeLapp is one of the founding faculty members and a very local resident, and he had actually brought it to the table. He said, you guys should really look at this. And it just came at this perfect moment with Getty's Pacific Standard Time. And at that time, that first iteration was looking at Southern California from the years 1945 to 1980. So it really fit the parameters quite well. And Laguna Art Museum, being a small museum, we always had the mentality of like, we're the little engine that could. And so to have Getty's support and all their, you know, their staff and support in that way was a really wonderful way to work.
So Grace, and for those of you who know our collection, you'll see one artist in particular in the background on the slide on the left. That is
Ron Davis.
Ron Davis, and we have a piece in the collection.
Yeah.
And the other artists that are in these images are?
So the arch is John Mason, and John Mason was a kind of abstract expressionist, ceramicist, kind of along the lines of Peter Voulkos. They worked together. And, but he also did these very precise geometric constructions. And John Mason was hired on at UCI to begin the ceramics studio and to open that up and bring in the facilities for that. So he was also one of the founding faculty members. And then the exhibition was kind of split up in two ways. It took up 2 floors. And the top floor, there were a lot of very object-based, formal kind of works. Works by Larry Bell, Ed Moses, John McLaughlin, Bob Irwin, all of these amazing light and space artists. Craig Kaufman was in there too. And then on the lower level, we had works, it worked out so well, of artists who were really working a lot in performance and exploring the body and working through film and all of that. So it kind of split up in this really interesting way.
Yeah, and I'm glad Grace mentioned those artists. Many of those are in our collection. So as you walk through the Center for Contemporary and Modern Art, you'll see a lot of those artists represented.
Yeah. John McCracken currently, and Tony DeLapp, and
yes.
yeah, it's great to see all of that.
So what's exciting about this moment is the faculty at UCI, and a number of them are portrayed here. And some of you've heard of, and some of you may not, but they have had a big influence on the contemporary world today. And why don't you share a little bit about what was happening at UCI at that time? Yeah,
so if anyone is familiar with Southern California, Irvine was basically a cow field, and it was owned by one family, Joan Irvine Smith, and she basically donated 1,000 acres to the university, and then they purchased more later on. So it was this open land in a lot of ways, and so the artists that came, it was really just through friends and connections. So there's a lot of stories of Larry Bell, you know, like he doesn't really remember being paid. Like it was just friends just coming to hang out and give talks and do studio critiques with students. But what I thought too was remarkable was Via Selmans was one of the early professors as a young woman artist at the time. And then John Mason and Ed Burrell, who is actually now in Bellingham, Washington, on a lovely farm, and did a lot of sort of assemblage type works at the time. And I think one of the gems for me in this exhibition was really being able to, we interviewed the artists quite deeply. So we tried to sit down with as many artists and get as much out of them and hear all of their stories. And as you imagine, this is the late 60s, early 70s, and a lot of young people exploring their freedom. So it was a lot of stories. So it was really wonderful. But yeah, so there were a lot of amazing artists that kind of would go through. And Bob Irwin would go to the races, and UCI was on the way, so he would drive and teach and then go to bet on the horses.
What kind of races?
Yeah.
Horse races. Okay, of course. And some of the students as well at this time.
Yeah.
And some of you may be familiar with these artists.
I think because the university was so new, there was a lot of interconnectedness between the professors and the students. And so you see on the left Nancy Buchanan and Walter Robinson doing a performance piece about the home. And one of the things is the number of women artists who, at this time, some were young mothers, some were older women coming back to school, and it was really interesting to learn about the sacrifices they had to make in order to pursue this field. And those were great, wonderful stories that sort of came out of it. Up in the center is F Space, which was in Santa Ana, and that was where Chris Burden, who was one of the first graduate students, and other friends of that time kind of had this space, and this was where the performance shoot was done. And then on the far right is Paula Sweet. So she's got this kind of strange clay mask on her face. And she was in John Mason's ceramic class, and she asked if she could do a performance. And John Mason said, sure, why not? And I think that was another amazing thing about this program was the kind of openness that the faculty had. And Ed Moses was another professor, and he would talk about how he completely did not understand Chris Burden, but he knew what he was doing was important and supported it and attended his performances. And I think to admit not understanding, but knowing for some reason the importance, I think was a really wonderful admission. And so John Mason, I think, was this kind of figure, and Paula Sweet did these crazy, wild performances with clay and using her body. But I'm also wearing a Paula Sweet dress. She went into design for a short stint of time, and then down below is Chris Burden with Charles Christopher Hill. And I wanted to show this piece because a lot of times in Chris Burden's performances, they exist through documentation of film and photography. So who filmed and who photographed? And really it was his fellow friends like Charles Christopher Hill who documented a lot of this early work.
So Chris Burden you probably know very well because of the lampposts in front of LACMA, which is often photographed at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. He also blew my mind when I was a young graduate student of learning about Shoot, which Grace had just mentioned, where he actually set up a situation where he was shot in the arm and had it documented, and documented that performance piece, and it's quite radical to say the least, but is in the history of art and really changed how artists use their bodies in performance in very challenging and awfully difficult and sometimes violent ways. But Chris was recently passed away, a very prolific and impactful artist. Very important moment. And some of the, talk a little bit, you can see more of Chris's pieces here in this image.
Yeah, so, excuse me. UC Irvine being so new, there was just nothing on campus. And I think what Chris Burden in our interview had talked about was you had to go out and buy your own tools and find a space and have your own studio. And I think in some ways it really pushed artists to, if you're really serious about being an artist, you've got to commit to it in this real way. And then for other artists, it also became, I don't have money, and I need to use the resources that I have available to me. And I think, too, this is maybe why performance was so prolific and was so, it came from such this wonderful moment as a result of it. So on the top left, Chris Burden did a 5-day lacquer piece where he trained his body prior till and then locked himself in one of the lockers and had 5 gallons of water above him and a 5-gallon empty bowl below him, and lived in that locker for 5 days. But then there are pieces like Charles Christopher Hill on the far right, and I love this piece, and it also, I made a reference to Kristen Kennedy's piece that's up on our Hoffman 4th floor right now, but really kind of coming from this pattern and decoration moment where he would take theater fabric, all the thrown away leftover fabric from UCI's theater department, and he would work on it, paint on it, sew on it, sew in newspaper scraps, and then bury it in his backyard and leave it there for like a year, and then unpack it. And then that disintegration would be part of the piece, but they would be really stunning at the same time.
So a fascinating time. I mean, the resource is limited, so they create a new art form. And then some of the faculty here, is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, so John Copeland's was the first UCI faculty to run the gallery. So, you know, and he started Art Forum magazine, which was also right at that moment when UCI was coming up. So this energy was really there, and he also brought in the national and international perspective into what was a Cowfield College campus. So I think that energy is really great. And then Frank Stella, they were able to bring in a lot of... Yes, on the lower right. Yeah, so they were able to bring in such a range of artists.
And our Stella is back up, if you haven't seen it, on the second and a half floor. I get confused. But we have one of the great Stellas here at the museum. So Grace put this quote up, and why don't you talk to us a little bit about what your thoughts were in presenting this?
Yeah. Well, in my Northwest department, we've had just 3 curators because it started in 2007. 10 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago.
10 years ago.
So I've been thinking a lot about lineage and what that means, and also in my own field, in the academic field, I loved my time at Berkeley, and my thought was, I'm going to be there forever and ever. And when you talk about graduate school, your professors will say, no, you have to go somewhere else and share your knowledge elsewhere, and we need to bring in other minds from other regions. And so I like thinking about that idea, and also what is collecting. And we have these parameters. We know what's missing, what time periods, what we need, what we don't need. There are all these objectives in some way, but also we do bring in our strengths, our perspectives, and then also as an institution questioning what is our identity, what do we mean to, in a civic way, what do we mean in a national or international way. So I like thinking about all those layers in collecting.
Yeah, and it's so important. I mean, each curator is shaping our future and what our children experience and future generations, and it's really powerful. It's very important. I'm glad you put this up there.
Oh, great.
And then we jumped right into one of your first acquisitions here, a very powerful piece by R.V. Smith. As many of you know, you may recall this exhibition that Bonnie put together, and then Grace came in and helped us acquire it. And it's of great significance for us. R.V., as you may know, a former teacher at PNCA, a painter who lives here in Portland, a wonderful gentleman who has spoken here before, and just a great partner in ours in the cultural community.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight just a couple of acquisitions that were, I feel like, pretty important. And with R.V. Smith, also to acknowledge the breadth of work that Bonnie did at this time. I mean, she really brought in a lot of women artists into the collection. And I told her when we were interviewing for thinking around Apex, she really kind of went punk rock at the end, the last 2. Like, she brought in Vanessa Rennick, and she brought in some tough subjects. And she was not shy about it, which I really admire. So she really brought this in, and I just did the easy part at the end. But I think this is such an amazing piece, and really, to me, this the kind of the punctum for me is the seeing one of the clan members in the foreground, and you see underneath his robe that he's wearing jeans and sneakers, and it just feels very contemporary, and it very much feels like the moment of what we're seeing in the news today. So, yeah.
So Grace and I had the fortunate opportunity to visit RV's studio, and this is not RV, but Grace then decided to turn the tides on me because she said, well, if you're interviewing me, how about I ask you a few questions? So Grace posed a few questions to me, and when we went to RV studio, it was really fascinating. I don't get to artist studios enough, but Grace and I went, and Grace took a very a certain perspective on how to approach the work, and I immediately went back to my own training. I've talked a little bit about this, but I was trained as a painter. First and foremost, my background is in art making, and this is my professor from the Art Students League. This is Frank Mason, who actually studied with Frank Vincent Dumont, who we have a picture in the collection here. Dumont actually came out to the Portland Northwest area and did a lot of work here, painted a lot as part of the California Impressionist School. Anyway, my professor, and that's Frank there, I studied very traditional painting, and the experience was about you paint all day, all night, and then on Saturday afternoons you go to a barn and get critiqued. And Frank took his paintbrush out and just destroyed your painting. That's what you see here. And eventually, hopefully, after 1,000 works, that's what he said, you have to paint 1,000 paintings. Maybe you can create something good. This is one of his paintings, which I just think is so beautiful. Really captures light. And to do this in a good way is really difficult. And Grace was sort of asking me, as I looked at RV's work, how do you approach art? And it was very much about the painting approach, so we wanted to talk a little bit about that. This is my painting, a painting that I did after years of study. This is actually in the south of France when I spent a summer over there, and was painting all the time, and it was just very gratifying. But also, I think my own painting, Grace, and I'll answer this with the audience, really shaped how I started to think about my museum work. I'm a trained medievalist, but ultimately that is something that I can rely on to some degree, but we don't really have medieval art here. So I go back to my training as a painter, and it was so gratifying for me to think about this exhibition like a painting. And I had Dawson working with me, and Mary, and a number of other individuals on the team here. And I think in many ways, for me, this was an expression of a painting. And to be able to see these Monets in our gallery so beautifully lit with the natural light was really gratifying. And I think, first and foremost, as I've spent time in museums, I'm going to continue to go back to my painting experiences and how we think about museums. And I also love the idea of museums as beautiful spaces, spaces that Mary Beth has said, spaces of wonder. I think that's the word you use. And I think that's really special for us and something we want to aspire to. But also what influenced me, I was blown away. This is Bruce Nauman. And he's a big influence on my life because I remember in graduate school reading his catalog that was written by actually Neil Benezra and Kathy Hallbreck for an exhibition at the Walker Art Center. And you can see, here I am talking about beauty and wonder, and this is Bruce Nauman, and it's totally a mess. It's a cacophony of objects and ideas. And again, perhaps one of the most influential, hard-hitting artists of the 60s and 70s and today. And if you don't know his work, we've shown some of it here. We've shown some of his dear plastic bodies. We've shown his heads. You've seen his neons. We showed a very annoying clown piece, which people still complain about, where the clown was yelling. Does everyone remember this piece? So I wanted to share this with you because I think he's one of the great artists. Here I am talking about beauty and wonder and painting. But one of the great artists, I think, is Bruce Nauman, so I wanted to show that. So that's a little bit of my influence as well. And I love that side of of an art museum to be able to do both.
Yeah.
Now, back to you, Grace. Marie Watt, this was an important acquisition that you oversaw
Yes.
with Sarah, and this is really exciting for us to have this. Marie is a wonderful artist here in the community, and we were able to acquire this.
Yes, so Marie, as some of you may know, does these pieces through kind of these sewing circles, very much in her native tradition, bringing a lot of people together. But one of the things she'll do is she'll put a call out, and anyone can come. They don't have to know how to sew, and it's a wonderful gathering. So she did this as a commissioned piece for, I think it was the Block Museum, and she anticipated a much smaller piece, and so many people showed up that she had to grow the scale of the piece. And it's a beautiful, celebratory object. I just love all the words in it. It's called Companion Species Ferocious Mother and Canis Familiaris, and she's really thinking about our interspecies relationships and thinking about motherhood and what does it mean to take care of others, to take care of the earth. So there are a lot of languages that come into play. Some are more activist, some are very maternal, and I just love it all together. The other thing that I love is how we came to acquire it, which was through the Ford Family Foundation, and they help support acquisitions with several institutions throughout Oregon. And then Dr. Lauren Lipson, whose lifetime work at the moment is to fill museums across America with contemporary Native American artists. And it's his kind of sole mission in life. So he was a wonderful supporter of this project.
Yeah, and if you get up to the Tacoma Art Museum, Marie just did a beautiful outdoor installation of a bronze piece. And she's traditionally known for her blankets, and she's done this series of blankets in bronze that sort of move around outside, right outside the building. So if you get up to Tacoma, please see that. This is a great piece, and that one as well. I want to speed up a little bit. I know I want to have time for questions. We're celebrating 10 years of Apex, and again, that's the program on the 4th floor, and Grace has done something very thoughtfully with a publication that she's putting together that's going to come out soon. And just tell us briefly about that publication.
Yeah, so I've interviewed Jennifer Gately, Bonnie Lang Malcolmson, and to talk about sort of their vision for the program and how they were thinking about representing the Northwest and bringing in contemporary artists. But also, for me, I wanted to see what that field looked like when you put all those 10 years together. So it's kind of thinking about this as a landscape in some ways too. But yeah, I think too it's also a celebration of a dedication to this project or this series that I wanted to celebrate.
So when does the publication come out? Remind me.
I think it should come out. I'm hoping for October.
Okay. Right.
But I'm also, I'm hoping for October.
Okay. So stay tuned. A wonderful documentation of this program. And upcoming opening actually this weekend?
Yep, this weekend it opens. Avanta Kabawa is our next Apex artist, and she's been studying the Veterans Memorial Coliseum for 3 years. It's been this obsessive process of drawing. So, really taking a minimalist approach and going back into, she's formally responded to sites through installations, and in this one it's really been about graphite on paper and getting messy in it, so, yeah.
And a quick preview of the next big exhibition, which will be on the main stage, which used to be the Contemporary Northwest Art Awards. Grace has taken a fresh look at this, and we're titling the exhibitions and thinking a little bit more broadly about it. And I want her to explain the title of the show, and then I want to run through some images as just a sneak peek. We're not going to talk much about them. We're just going to show you images of what you're going to see coming next spring.
Yeah. So the map is not the territory. I did visits along the coastal regions, so Oregon, Washington, Vancouver, BC, and then up to Alaska. And for the next iteration, I hope to dive deep into the interior regions. But for the connections I wanted to bring in too was our economics, the shared economics shared by the Pacific Ocean, and those resources that get used or exploited and along those things. And also, I didn't want to impose a theme, but I wanted to kind of understand what artists are responding to and what are they thinking about, and finding ways to connect those conversations. So I want this to be sort of a generative exhibition. But the map is not the territory comes from a phrase by Alfred Sibinski, who's a scientist philosopher in the 40s and 50s, and it's just this idea of this kind of metaphor of what one believes, the difference between what one believes and the reality of what one is, and the map is often that. And also territory is a very problematic term. This ownership of land, this what is that? So I like that the problem is also in the title.
Thank you. And some of the works you'll see, this is a video installation by
Fernanda D'Agostino, who's based in Portland.
That'll be quite dynamic and exciting.
Yes.
Ryan
Pierce,
yes.
Yeah, who's local. And, you know, really thinking about sort of archaeologies of the future, post-climate change, post-capitalism, what would that look like? Marianne Peters is a Seattle-based artist whose roots are in Syria. So she's been really responding to this Syrian refugee crisis through beautiful installations. Charlene Vickers is an Ojibwe artist, and she's really thinking a lot about native urbanism in this sort of humorous but also heartfelt kind of way. And Henry Sang is Vancouver, BC artist who's really thinking a lot about dislocations and disruptions in cultures and histories. And his work over the years has turned more into sort of social practice. So we'll see what we're gonna, and then Rob Ree is a Seattle-based artist, and one of the projects that he's working on is creating these structures and raising these resilient gourds within them, and they turn into these kind of temporal sculptures. Annette Bellamy was one of the amazing visits I did, and she lives on an island in Halibut Cove, Alaska. She's been a fisherwoman for 45 years, so she is responding very directly to the land and the ocean that she works in, and also thinking about craft in this very different or elevated kind of way, I think. And Jenny Irene Miller is a very young Inupiaq artist in Anchorage, and she, in this project, it's called Continuous, and she's really doing a series of interviews of young people who identify as gay or other, transgender, or and kind of decolonizing sexuality, and through these stories, resharing with the elders maybe some of the things that they have forgotten through colonization.
And the studio visits were also so much part of your job here, and it's been fun. I know you've visited Lucinda and Judy Cook, and Grace is often out and about, which is really very important for the curators, and in particular her area. But I wanted to show two more slides. What I think is really important for us to emphasize that our collections and our museum and our program are really shaped by individuals and people, and it's the people behind them. And one of the fun things that I've enjoyed is learning more about our team here, learning more about the curator. So I've asked them to give us a little personal slice about their lives, and I asked Grace, okay, give me something here. So what are we looking at here, Grace?
So on the left is a photo of my husband on the Oregon coast and his sister and cousin. So, and on the right is my son, Dennis, enjoying all that is the Oregon coast and the reason why we're here. And then also what I love so much about my job is being active, to be able to think about the place and to be able to visit with artists, and then the moments when I can also bring my family with me, and all of that, the mess of all of that coming together is really a great joy. So that's Annette Bellamy, and we're taking the boat over to her studio in Halibut Cove, and that was just this summer.
Grace, thank you so much.
Thank
you for sharing a little bit about your life with us.
Great, thank you.
I'm very excited for the future, and Grace, thanks for your leadership. Happy to take some questions. Anyone? Suggestions also for our program? It's really important. But we have a mic here. Charles has the mic. Let us know if you have any questions or comments.
I have the opportunity to ask you this in private, but I thought maybe others had the same question. I frequently refer to you as having the most dangerous job at the museum. And maybe you can tell us a little bit, how did you, coming from California, immerse yourself in the regional art? That's a really big ask to bring someone and ask them all of a sudden to be responsible for artists that they may never have heard of before. Can you tell us a little bit about how you tackled that?
Yeah, thank you. So I love, there is no degree in Northwest art history, so you have to learn on the job. And so for me to be actively engaged in the community is something, to do studio visits, to me, that's like the perk of my job. So to do that actively, and then we have an amazing collection, so to be able to dive into that, to rely on our staff and their institutional history and all of that, to basically be paid to be a student, I think in that way is pretty darn amazing. So I think that's how I see it. And then, as Brian had stated, when I moved here first for my family, so I wasn't employed with the museum, but I was still acting as curator. So I was riding around town and still doing studio visits because I wouldn't know what else to do with my time. Yeah.
Thank you for all you've done, Grace. I really enjoyed taking a class with you at PSU last year, and I see some familiar things.
Thank you.
Students who were in that class are here. One of the things I've really noticed about the reworking you've done on the 3rd and 4th floor is how many women artists are in the museum's collection. And who would have known? But now we know. There's no excuse for anybody who comes to the museum not knowing how well represented, comparatively to most places, women are in the collection, and how we still have much more that we can do, and I count on you to do it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, yes. So my 3rd, 4th floor Hoffman galleries are devoted to the permanent collection, and for me, again, because my knowledge of the region is not deep, was to think about sort of themes or groupings, and so that's how my rotations have sort of taken on. But also, we do have a lot of women artists, particularly in this region, and quite early on. And I'm especially taken with our photography, like Lily Wright and Myra Albert Wiggins, and it's pretty amazing. And I don't know if it's something about the West. And they were socialites to be in the West and to yet take on this rugged terrain and to be able to be artists, I think is, yeah, definitely in need of surveying and looking at.
So Linda, thank you for mentioning that. I think that's really important. It's a nice observation.
Somewhat abstract and maybe unformed question about curating contemporary art and art that's sometimes not even finished. Does this mean that the museum, this museum and other museums, now have a role not just in curating collections of works of long deceased artists and sculptors, but of creating, having a synergistic relationship with artists and sculptors so that you are actually part of the creative process by expressing the interest of a museum in their work? Is this a different role of a museum, or is it just that I'm hearing about it for the first time?
You want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, It is certainly changing what a curator is in terms of contemporary art and how you work with the artist. But and there are some models where a museum might commission an artwork or work closely with artists. You know, what I enjoy so much about the Apex exhibitions is it does feel like a collaboration and really not so much of me imposing my knowledge or my agenda, but more about giving a space up to the artist who would want to do something that's not just about selling a work, but about exploring possibilities or ideas. But I don't think it comes from a place of the museum imposing something upon the artist in terms of what the outcome of that work would be.
Yeah, there's a lot of partnerships and co-creation is happening in the contemporary world, and artists, a lot of the artists you've seen, they've either studied the history of art or studied museum practices in addition to their own discipline, and they're multifaceted, and it's been really gratifying, I think, for the field to have those partnerships and those collaborations come together and make something very meaningful. And a lot of the curators are sure, they work very closely with the artists, and artists can inform our program. It's certainly important. And, you know, I think throughout history you could look back in time as well. I mean, going back to the Renaissance, where the artists were partnering with their institutions to create works of art, whether it was the church or the political legislative bodies of the time, to co-create. Thank you.
I have something very simple. That's a great-looking child. Is that your son? Is that your son? Or
Yes, yeah. So this is Dennis.
He is great-looking.
Thank you.
I love art, and I belong, etc. But that's great. I think it's great. Your children get your family gets to go around too.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I was telling Grace, you know, I've raised my children here, and I think probably several of you have as well. And what a special place to raise our children and to have them experience this great part of the Northwest, and that just sums it up. Well, thank you so much for supporting our museum. Thank you for being here. Great to see everyone.
Thank you.